Sarah Martinez wiped the grease from her hands as she looked up at the massive Boeing 737 towering above her in the hangar. For 3 years, she had been crawling through the belly of these metal giants, checking engines, replacing parts, and ensuring every bolt was perfectly tightened. The other mechanics respected her work, but they never stopped reminding her that she was different. She was the only woman in a crew of 28 men at Rocky Mountain Airlines. Every morning, Sarah arrived at the maintenance facility before sunrise. While her colleagues grabbed coffee and complained about their wives or weekend plans, she studied flight manuals in the break room. The thick books were filled with diagrams of cockpit instruments, emergency procedures, and navigation systems. Her supervisor, Tom Bradley, often found her there with her nose buried in these technical guides. "You know those books won't make you a pilot, Martinez," Tom would say with a smirk. "Stick to what you know best, fixing what's broken." But Sarah had a secret dream that burned inside her chest like a small flame that refused to die. She wanted to fly, not just as a passenger, but as the person in control, making decisions thousands of feet above the ground. She had been taking flying lessons at the local airport for 2 years, using every spare dollar from her paycheck to pay for instruction time. Her flight instructor, Captain Jennifer Walsh, believed in her abilities, but the commercial aviation world seemed like an impossible mountain to climb. The airline industry in 1994 was still very much a man's world. Female pilots were rare, and female mechanics were even rarer. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Colorado where her father owned a car repair shop. He taught her how to use tools before she could properly ride a bicycle. When other girls her age were playing with dolls, Sarah was learning how to rebuild carburetors and change transmission fluid. Her path to aviation began during a high school field trip to Denver International Airport. Standing on the observation deck watching planes take off and land, something clicked inside her mind. She knew she wanted to be part of this world of controlled chaos, where precision and skill kept hundreds of people safe in the sky. After graduation, Sarah applied to every airline maintenance program she could find. Rocky Mountain Airlines finally gave her a chance, but only after she scored higher on the mechanical aptitude test than any candidate they had seen in 5 years. Even then, some of the senior mechanics made it clear they doubted a young woman could handle the physical demands of the job. Sarah proved them wrong every single day. She could troubleshoot electrical problems that stumped veterans with decades of experience. Her small hands could reach into tight spaces that larger men couldn't access. She developed a reputation for finding problems that others missed, and pilots specifically requested that she inspect their aircraft before important flights. But despite her success as a mechanic, Sarah's real dream remained hidden. She continued her flight training in secret, afraid that her employers would see it as a distraction or sign of disloyalty. In the corporate world of aviation, mechanics were expected to stay mechanics, and pilots came from very different backgrounds, usually military service or expensive flight schools that Sarah could never afford. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, Sarah was assigned to perform a routine inspection on Flight 447, scheduled to depart for Phoenix at 2:30 p.m. The aircraft had been experiencing minor electrical issues, and the previous shift had replaced several components in the cockpit. It was Sarah's job to verify that everything was working correctly before the plane was cleared for passenger service. As she climbed into the cockpit with her inspection checklist, Sarah felt the familiar thrill of being surrounded by all those switches, gauges, and controls. She knew what most of them did, not just from her maintenance training but from her private flying lessons. Her hands moved confidently across the instrument panel, checking connections and testing systems. Captain Mike Rodriguez, the pilot scheduled to fly 447 that afternoon, stopped by during her inspection. He was one of the few pilots who treated Sarah with genuine respect, often asking her opinion on technical matters. "How's she looking today, Sarah?" he asked, settling into the pilot's seat. "Everything checks out perfectly," Sarah replied, making notes on her clipboard. "The new electrical components are functioning within normal parameters. You should have a smooth flight to Phoenix." Captain Rodriguez nodded and began his own pre-flight preparations. He had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, the skilled mechanic working beside him would be the only thing standing between his passengers and disaster. Sarah finished her inspection and climbed down from the cockpit, gathering her tools and heading back to the maintenance office. She had 3 more aircraft to inspect before her shift ended, and then she planned to drive to the small airport where she took flying lessons. She was working toward her commercial pilot's license, though she wondered if she would ever get the chance to use it professionally. The afternoon sun streamed through the hangar windows as Sarah completed her paperwork. Flight 447 was cleared for service, and she watched through the office window as the ground crew began preparing it for passengers. In 2 hours, 34 people would board that aircraft, trusting their lives to the skill of the pilot and the thoroughness of her mechanical inspection. None of them, including Sarah herself, could imagine that before the day was over, their safety would depend not on Captain Rodriguez's flying skills, but on everything Sarah had learned during those secret hours of flight training. The woman they saw only as a mechanic was about to become their most important hope for survival. Flight 447 pushed back from the gate at exactly 2:30 p.m., carrying 34 passengers and 3 crew members. Captain Mike Rodriguez felt confident as he taxied toward the runway. Sarah's inspection had been thorough, and all systems showed green on his instrument panel. His co-pilot, First Officer Janet Chen, completed the final checklist items as they waited for clearance from air traffic control. Sarah was in the maintenance office when she heard Flight 447's engines roar to life on the tarmac outside. She glanced up from her paperwork to watch the aircraft roll down the runway and lift gracefully into the bright Colorado sky. Within minutes, it was just a small speck disappearing toward the mountains. 20 minutes into the flight, as the Boeing 737 climbed through 15,000 feet, Captain Rodriguez began feeling strange. At first, it was just a slight dizziness that he attributed to the morning coffee he had skipped. But the feeling quickly grew worse. His vision became blurry and sweat began forming on his forehead despite the cool cockpit temperature. "Mike, are you okay?" First Officer Chen asked, noticing her captain's pale complexion. "I'm not feeling well," Rodriguez admitted, his voice already sounding strained. "Something's wrong." Within seconds, the captain's condition deteriorated rapidly. His hands trembled on the controls and he struggled to focus on the instruments. Chen immediately took control of the aircraft while trying to assess what was happening to her fellow pilot. Rodriguez's breathing became labored, and he started clutching his chest. "Denver Center, this is Rocky Mountain 447. Chen radioed urgently. "We have a medical emergency on board. The captain is incapacitated and we need to return to Denver immediately." The air traffic controller's voice crackled back through the headset. "Rocky Mountain 447, roger. Turn right heading 180. Descend and maintain 10,000 feet. Emergency equipment will be standing by." But as First Officer Chen began the emergency descent, she too started experiencing the same symptoms that had struck Captain Rodriguez. Her head began spinning, and her hands felt weak on the controls. The realization hit her like a cold wave. Whatever was affecting the captain was now affecting her as well. In the passenger cabin, flight attendant Maria Santos noticed that several passengers were also beginning to feel unwell. An elderly man in row 12 was having trouble breathing, and a young mother with her baby looked extremely pale. Maria's own vision was starting to blur as she made her way toward the cockpit. Back in the maintenance hangar, Sarah was completing an inspection on another aircraft when her radio crackled to life. It was Tom Bradley, her supervisor, and his voice carried an urgency she had never heard before. "Sarah, get to the emergency command center immediately. We have a situation with Flight 447. Sarah's heart sank as she ran across the tarmac toward the terminal building. The emergency command center was only used for the most serious situations: hijackings, engine failures, or crashes. As she burst through the door, she found a room full of worried faces staring at radar screens and radio equipment. "What's happening?" Sarah asked breathlessly. "Flight 447 is in trouble," explained Chief Operations Officer Robert Hayes. "Both pilots are incapacitated, and it appears to be some kind of poisoning or contamination. The first officer managed to get the plane turned around and started the descent, but she's losing consciousness. We have about 15 minutes before they reach Denver airspace." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "What about the flight attendant? Can she help?" "She's affected too, along with about half the passengers. Whatever's causing this seems to be spreading through the cabin air system." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the gravity of the situation. A commercial airliner with 37 people on board was flying on autopilot, with no one capable of landing it safely. The aircraft was still 20 minutes away from Denver International Airport, and every passing second brought them closer to disaster. "Do we have any pilots on the ground who can talk them through an emergency landing?" Sarah asked. Hayes shook his head grimly. "Even if we did, There's no one conscious in that cockpit to follow instructions. The autopilot will keep the plane flying straight and level, but it can't land the aircraft. Sarah's mind raced as she thought about the technical aspects of the situation. She knew Flight 447 systems better than anyone. She had just finished inspecting every component that morning. She also knew that the autopilot would eventually run out of programmed instructions, and the aircraft would either start flying in circles or begin an uncontrolled descent. "What about emergency procedures?" she asked. "Can't the autopilot be programmed to perform an automatic landing?" "Not on this aircraft model," Hayes replied. "The 737-300 requires manual control for landing. Someone needs to be conscious and capable in that cockpit, or everyone on board is going to die." The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. 37 lives were hanging in the balance, including Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen, two people Sarah had worked with and respected for years. The passengers included families with children, business travelers, and elderly couples. All innocent people who had boarded the flight expecting a routine trip to Phoenix. Sarah stared at the radar screen showing Flight 447's position. The aircraft was flying steadily at 10,000 feet, but she could see that it was slowly drifting off course as the autopilot struggled to maintain its programmed heading. Soon, air traffic control would need to start vectoring other aircraft around the disabled plane to prevent a mid-air collision. "There has to be something we can do," Sarah said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. Hayes looked at her with sad eyes. "Unless someone can figure out how to get into that cockpit and land the plane, we're looking at the worst aviation disaster in Colorado history." As the seconds ticked by, Sarah found herself thinking about all those hours she had spent studying flight manuals and practicing in flight simulators. She thought about Captain Jennifer Walsh, her flight instructor, who had always told her that she had natural flying instincts. Most of all, she thought about the 37 people trapped in that aluminum tube, depending on someone to save their lives. The radio crackled again with an update from air traffic control. "Flight 447 is now 12 minutes from Denver airspace. Still no response from the cockpit." The emergency command center buzzed with desperate activity as officials tried every possible solution. Phone calls were made to the Federal Aviation Administration, military bases, and even NASA, searching for anyone who might have an idea about how to save Flight 447. But every expert reached the same conclusion. Without a conscious pilot in the cockpit, the aircraft was doomed. Sarah stood near the back of the room, listening to the increasingly frantic radio communications. Air traffic controllers were trying to reach anyone on the aircraft who might be able to respond, but their calls went unanswered. The silence from Flight 447 was more terrifying than any distress call could have been. "We need to consider our options," announced Regional Director Patricia Coleman, who had just arrived from the airline's corporate headquarters. "If that plane goes down in a populated area, we could be looking at hundreds of casualties on the ground as well." The room fell silent as everyone understood what she was suggesting. Military fighters were already being scrambled to intercept Flight 447, and if necessary, they might have to shoot it down over an unpopulated area to prevent a larger disaster. It was an unthinkable decision, but one that aviation authorities had planned for since September 11th. Sarah felt sick to her stomach as she listened to these discussions. The idea of deliberately destroying an aircraft with 37 innocent people aboard went against everything she believed in. There had to be another way, some solution that the experts were missing. "Wait," Sarah said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tense conversations. "What if someone could get onto the plane while it's still in the air?" The room turned to look at her, and Chief Operations Officer Hayes shook his head. "Sarah, this isn't a movie. You can't just jump from one aircraft to another at 10,000 feet. "No, but what about a helicopter?" Sarah pressed on, her mind racing with possibilities. If a helicopter could get close enough to the aircraft, maybe someone could transfer over. Director Coleman frowned. "Even if that were possible, which it isn't, who would we send? It would have to be someone who knows how to fly that specific aircraft type. And we don't have any qualified pilots available who could make such a dangerous transfer." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would shock everyone in the room. "I could do it." The silence that followed was deafening. Hayes stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "Sarah, you're a mechanic. This requires a commercial pilot with years of experience." "I have over 200 hours of flight time," Sarah replied firmly. I'm working on my commercial license, and I've been studying 737 systems for 3 years. I know that aircraft better than anyone. Flight time in what? A little Cessna trainer? Scoffed Tom Bradley, who had been quiet until now. This is a commercial airliner with 37 lives at stake. You can't seriously think that your weekend flying lessons qualify you for this. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with anger and frustration. Those people are going to die anyway if we don't try something. At least I have a chance of getting the plane on the ground safely. Director Coleman studied Sarah with new interest. Even if you could somehow get aboard the aircraft, the pilots are unconscious from some kind of contamination. How would you avoid being affected the same way? We could equip whoever goes with oxygen equipment, Sarah replied quickly. If it's something in the air system, breathing apparatus might provide protection. The room erupted in debate as officials argued about the feasibility and risks of such a plan. Some thought it was completely insane, while others began to see it as their only remaining option. Time was running out. Flight 447 was now less than 10 minutes from Denver airspace, and decisions needed to be made immediately. Captain Jennifer Walsh burst through the door at that moment. Having been called in as an emergency consultant, Sarah's flight instructor took one look at the situation and immediately grasped what was being discussed. Is it true that Sarah volunteered to attempt a helicopter transfer? Walsh asked Director Coleman. Yes, but we're still evaluating whether it's even possible, Coleman replied. Walsh turned to Sarah with serious eyes. I won't lie to you. This would be the most dangerous thing anyone has ever attempted in civilian aviation. The chances of success are very small and the chances of survival even smaller. But it could work? Sarah asked. Theoretically, yes. Military pilots have performed similar transfers in combat situations. But Sarah, you need to understand that even if you successfully get aboard that aircraft, landing a commercial airliner is incredibly complex. One mistake and everyone dies. Sarah looked around the room at all the worried faces. She thought about Captain Rodriguez, who had always treated her with respect and kindness. She thought about First Officer Chen, who had 3 young children at home. She thought about the passengers who had trusted their lives to the airline's safety procedures. I have to try, Sarah said quietly. I can't just stand here and watch them die when there might be something I can do to help. Director Coleman made a quick phone call to the Colorado National Guard, explaining the situation and asking about helicopter availability. Within minutes, she had an answer that surprised everyone. There's a military rescue helicopter crew training at Peterson Air Force Base, she announced. They have experience with high-risk transfers and they're willing to attempt the mission. But they need to know right now if we're going to do this. All eyes turned to Sarah. In the span of 5 minutes, she had gone from being a maintenance worker filling out inspection reports to volunteering for what might be the most dangerous rescue attempt in aviation history. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Tell them yes. Get me that oxygen equipment and brief me on the helicopter transfer procedures. Those people are counting on us. As officials rushed to coordinate the unprecedented rescue attempt, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to calm her racing heart. She had trained for years to become a pilot, but she never imagined her first real test would come under such extreme circumstances. The radio crackled with an update from air traffic control. Flight 447 is now 6 minutes from Denver airspace. Beginning emergency vector procedures for incoming traffic. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of frantic preparation. While Sarah was fitted with military oxygen equipment and given a crash course in helicopter transfer procedures, the Colorado National Guard helicopter raced toward Flight 447's position. The rescue crew, led by Chief Warrant Officer David Kim, had performed similar operations in combat zones, but never with a civilian volunteer attempting to board a commercial airliner. Sarah's hands trembled as she strapped on the safety harness and checked her oxygen mask. Captain Walsh stayed close beside her, reviewing emergency landing procedures and trying to prepare her student for what lay ahead. Remember, the autopilot is keeping the plane stable right now, Walsh explained quickly. Your first priority is to get into the pilot's seat and assess the situation. Don't try to change anything until you understand what systems are still functioning. The helicopter lifted off from Denver International Airport and immediately began climbing toward Flight 447's altitude. Through the window, Sarah could see the Boeing 737 in the distance, flying straight and level like a ghost ship. From this distance, it looked peaceful and normal, giving no indication of the life and death drama playing out inside. 2 minutes to intercept. announced Chief Kim through the intercom. Ms. Martinez, I need you to understand that once we get close to that aircraft, we'll have maybe 30 seconds to complete the transfer. The downwash from our rotor could destabilize their flight path if we stay too close for too long. Sarah nodded, trying to suppress the fear that was building in her chest. She had practiced rappelling during her military reserve training, but never onto a moving aircraft thousands of feet above the ground. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and she would fall to her death while the passengers she was trying to save continued toward their own doom. As the helicopter approached Flight 447, Sarah could see the aircraft more clearly. The passenger windows looked dark, and there was no sign of movement in the cockpit. The plane's autopilot was holding course, but she noticed that it was gradually losing altitude as the system struggled with the unconscious pilot's weight against the controls. Flight 447. This is National Guard Rescue Helicopter Tango 7, Chief Kim radioed. We are attempting passenger transfer. Please maintain current heading and altitude. There was no response from the aircraft, just as expected. Sarah watched as the helicopter maneuvered into position above the Boeing 737's fuselage. The plan was for her to rappel down to the aircraft's roof and then enter through the overwing emergency exit, which could be opened from the outside. 30 seconds, announced the crew chief. Sarah, are you ready? Sarah looked down at the aircraft below her feet and felt her stomach drop. The wind was buffeting the helicopter, and the Boeing 737 looked impossibly small as a landing target. But she thought about the 37 people inside that plane, and her fear transformed into determination. I'm ready, she said firmly. The helicopter door slid open, and Sarah felt the full force of the wind and noise. Below her, the white roof of the Boeing 737 seemed to be moving much faster than she had expected. The crew chief checked her equipment one final time and gave her the signal. Sarah stepped to the edge of the helicopter and began her descent. The first few seconds were terrifying as she dropped through the open air between the two aircraft. The wind tried to push her away from her target, but her military training kicked in, and she managed to control her descent. Her feet touched the aircraft's roof with a jarring impact that she felt through her entire body. For a moment, she struggled to maintain her balance on the smooth metal surface, while the helicopter pulled away to a safer distance. The noise was incredible. Between the aircraft's engines and the wind rushing past at 200 miles per hour, she could barely think. Working quickly, Sarah made her way to the overwing emergency exit. She had studied the procedures dozens of times during her maintenance training, but doing it while standing on the roof of a flying aircraft was completely different. Her hands shook as she located the external release mechanism and pulled the handle. The emergency exit popped open, and Sarah immediately smelled something strange in the air flowing out of the cabin. It was a sweet chemical odor that she didn't recognize, but she was grateful for her oxygen mask as she lowered herself through the opening. Inside the aircraft, the scene was heartbreaking. Passengers were slumped in their seats, unconscious but still breathing. A few were beginning to stir, suggesting that whatever had affected them was starting to wear off. Sarah moved quickly through the cabin toward the cockpit, where she found both pilots unconscious but alive. Captain Rodriguez was slumped over the controls, his weight causing the aircraft to gradually descend. First Officer Chen was unconscious in the right seat, her hands fallen away from the instrument panel. Sarah carefully moved Rodriguez away from the controls and slipped into the pilot's seat. The instrument panel looked both familiar and terrifying. She had studied these systems for years and practiced on flight simulators, but this was her first time sitting in the captain's seat of a real commercial airliner, with lives depending on her actions. Her hands moved automatically to the controls as her training took over. Denver Center, this is Flight 447, Sarah radioed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I'm a qualified pilot who has boarded the aircraft. Both original crew members are unconscious but stable. I'm assuming control of the aircraft and requesting vectors for emergency landing. The response from air traffic control was immediate and relieved. Flight 447, Roger. State your qualifications and current aircraft status. I'm a licensed pilot with 737 systems knowledge, Sarah replied, not mentioning that she was actually the aircraft's maintenance technician. Aircraft is stable at 8,500 feet and descending. All engine parameters appear normal. I need guidance for emergency approach to Denver International. As Sarah began the complex process of preparing for an emergency landing, she could hear passengers beginning to wake up in the cabin behind her. She had successfully completed the most dangerous part of her mission, but the hardest challenge still lay ahead: getting 37 people safely back to the ground. Sarah's hands gripped the controls of Flight 447 as she tried to process the overwhelming amount of information flowing from the instrument panel. The aircraft was descending through 7,000 feet, and she needed to make critical decisions quickly. Her years of studying flight manuals and practicing on simulators had prepared her for this moment. But the reality was far more intense than any training scenario. Flight 447, Denver approach, came the calm voice of the air traffic controller. Turn left heading 090, descend and maintain 5,000 feet. We're clearing all traffic from your approach path. Sarah acknowledged the instruction and began the turn, feeling the massive aircraft respond to her controlled inputs. The Boeing 737 handled differently than the small training planes she was used to flying, but the basic principles were the same. She focused on maintaining smooth, steady control movements while constantly scanning the instruments for any signs of trouble. Behind her in the cabin, passengers were beginning to regain consciousness. Flight attendant Maria Santos was among the first to wake up, and she immediately realized that someone new was in the cockpit. Despite feeling dizzy and nauseous from whatever had affected the crew, Maria made her way forward to assess the situation. "Who are you?" Maria asked Sarah, her voice weak but concerned. "I'm Sarah Martinez, an aircraft mechanic and pilot," Sarah replied without taking her eyes off the instruments. "I boarded from a helicopter to help. The captain and first officer are unconscious but alive. Can you check on the passengers and see how many are awake?" Maria nodded and made her way back through the cabin. About half the passengers were beginning to stir, including the elderly man who had been one of the first affected. A young businessman in row 8 was fully conscious and helping a confused elderly woman understand what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maria announced over the intercom, her voice still shaky, "this is your flight attendant. We've experienced a medical emergency, but a qualified pilot is now in control of the aircraft. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened as we prepare for an emergency landing in Denver." In the cockpit, Sarah was working through the approach checklist with help from air traffic control. The controller handling Flight 447 was Captain Lisa Park, an experienced pilot herself who had volunteered to personally guide the aircraft to safety. "Flight 447, you're doing great," Captain Park radioed. "I need you to configure the aircraft for landing. Start by reducing power and extending the flaps to position 15. Sarah's hands moved to the throttles and flap controls, procedures she had practiced hundreds of times in her mind. The aircraft's behavior changed as she reduced power and the flaps extended, creating more drag and allowing for a steeper descent angle. She could feel the plane wanting to slow down, which was exactly what she needed for the approach. "Flaps 15, power reduced," Sarah reported. "Aircraft is stable and responding normally to all controls." Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see Denver International Airport in the distance. Emergency vehicles were already positioned along the runway, their red and blue lights flashing like a beacon of hope. She knew that dozens of rescue workers were standing by, ready to respond the moment Flight 447 touched down. Captain Rodriguez began to stir in the seat beside her, slowly regaining consciousness as the effects of the mysterious contamination wore off. His eyes opened with confusion, and it took him several seconds to understand that someone else was flying his aircraft. "What? Who are you?" he asked weakly. "I'm Sarah Martinez from maintenance," Sarah replied, keeping her focus on the approach. "You've been unconscious for about 40 minutes. I came aboard from a helicopter to help get everyone down safely." Rodriguez tried to sit up straighter, but he was still too weak to take control. "Sarah, you're the mechanic who inspected this plane today. Do you know how to land a 737? We're about to find out," Sarah replied with more confidence than she felt. The aircraft was now on final approach, lined up with runway 34R. Sarah could see the runway lights stretching out ahead of her like a pathway to safety. Captain Park continued providing guidance, but ultimately, the landing would depend on Sarah's skill and training. "Flight 447, you're cleared to land runway 34R, came the controller's voice. "Emergency equipment is standing by. You're looking good on the approach." Sarah took a deep breath and focused on the fundamentals of landing that Captain Walsh had drilled into her during their training sessions. Keep the runway centerline aligned, maintain proper airspeed, and control the descent rate. The ground was rushing up to meet them now, and she could see individual emergency vehicles positioned along the runway. At 500 feet above the ground, Sarah began her final descent. The aircraft was stable and on course, but she knew the next minute would be the most critical. Landing a commercial airliner required precise timing and control with no room for error. "You can do this, Sarah," she heard Captain Rodriguez say weakly from beside her. "Trust your training." The runway threshold passed beneath them and Sarah began the flare, pulling back gently on the controls to raise the nose and slow the aircraft's descent rate. She could feel the plane responding to her inputs, settling toward the runway with what she hoped was the right combination of speed and descent angle. Through the cabin, passengers who were conscious enough to understand what was happening held their breath as they prepared for landing. Maria Santos had briefed them on emergency procedures, and everyone was in the proper brace position. The main landing gear touched the runway with a firm but controlled impact, and Sarah immediately deployed the aircraft's speed brakes and began applying the wheel brakes. The Boeing 737 rolled down the runway, gradually slowing as Sarah maintained control of the aircraft's direction. "Flight 447 is on the ground and rolling," Sarah reported to air traffic control, unable to keep the relief out of her voice. As the aircraft came to a complete stop on the runway, emergency vehicles immediately surrounded them. Paramedics would soon be boarding to check on the passengers and crew, and investigators would begin trying to determine what had caused the mysterious contamination. But for now, 37 people were safely on the ground, thanks to a mechanic who had dared to believe she could fly when it mattered most. The moment Flight 447 came to a complete stop on the runway, emergency teams swarmed the aircraft like a well-coordinated army. Paramedics rushed aboard to check on the passengers and crew, while firefighters stood ready in case of any delayed emergency. Sarah remained in the pilot's seat, her hands still gripping the controls, unable to fully believe that she had actually succeeded. Captain Rodriguez, though still weak, managed to place a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Outstanding job," he said quietly. "I've been flying for 20 years and I couldn't have done better myself." Within minutes, paramedics were helping the unconscious First Officer Chen and checking on passengers who were still groggy from their exposure to whatever had contaminated the aircraft. Most passengers were conscious by now, though many complained of headaches and nausea. The elderly man who had been among the first affected was taken off the aircraft on a stretcher as a precaution. Sarah finally released her grip on the controls and allowed herself to be escorted off the aircraft by emergency personnel. As she stepped onto the tarmac, she was immediately surrounded by reporters who had somehow learned about the dramatic rescue. Camera flashes exploded around her as journalists shouted questions about the helicopter transfer and emergency landing. "Ms. Martinez, how did you manage to land a commercial airliner with only private pilot training?" called out one reporter. "Is it true that you rappelled from a helicopter onto the aircraft?" shouted another. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention and grateful when airport security officers escorted her away from the media crowd. She was taken to a quiet office where Federal Aviation Administration investigators were waiting to debrief her about the incident. The lead investigator, Dr. Patricia Williams, had flown in from Washington, D.C. as soon as news of the emergency reached FAA headquarters. She had investigated hundreds of aviation incidents, but nothing quite like this. "Ms. Martinez, I need to understand exactly what happened from your perspective," Dr. Williams began. "Walk me through the entire sequence of events from the moment you volunteered for the helicopter transfer." For the next 2 hours, Sarah provided a detailed account of her actions. She explained her background, her flight training, and every decision she had made during the emergency landing. Dr. Williams took careful notes and asked probing questions about Sarah's qualifications and decision-making process. Meanwhile, other investigators were examining Flight 447 to determine what had caused the crew and passengers to lose consciousness. Initial tests revealed high levels of carbon monoxide in the cabin air system, apparently caused by a faulty seal in one of the engine components that had allowed exhaust gases to enter the aircraft's ventilation system. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. The contamination had been caused by exactly the type of mechanical problem that Sarah would normally be responsible for detecting during her inspections. However, the faulty seal had developed during the flight itself, making it impossible to catch during pre-flight maintenance checks. News of Sarah's heroic actions spread rapidly across the country. By evening, her story was the lead item on every major news network. Headlines proclaimed, Mechanic saves 37 lives with daring helicopter rescue, and woman pilot defies the odds in aviation miracle. The airline industry, initially skeptical of Sarah's credentials, quickly embraced her as a hero. Rocky Mountain Airlines held a press conference where CEO Jonathan Mitchell praised Sarah's extraordinary courage and skill under impossible circumstances. He announced that the airline was promoting her to a new position in their flight training department and would pay for her to complete her commercial pilot certification. Captain Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's flight instructor, was overwhelmed with pride when she spoke to reporters. I always knew Sarah had exceptional flying skills, but what she did today goes beyond anything I could have imagined. She saved 37 lives through pure determination and skill. The passengers of Flight 447 were equally grateful. Many of them attended a ceremony at the airport 2 days later to personally thank Sarah for her actions. Margaret Thompson, the elderly woman who had been helped by other passengers during the emergency, spoke for the group. "We owe our lives to this brave young woman," Thompson said with tears in her eyes. "She risked everything to save complete strangers. There aren't enough words to express our gratitude." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from her fellow mechanics and pilots at Rocky Mountain Airlines. These were the people who had worked with Sarah every day, who had seen her dedication and skill firsthand. Tom Bradley, her former supervisor who had once doubted her flying aspirations, was among the first to congratulate her. "I was wrong about you, Sarah," Bradley admitted. "You've proven that being a great mechanic and a great pilot aren't mutually exclusive. You understand these aircraft better than anyone." The National Transportation Safety Board launched a full investigation into the incident, not only to determine the cause of the carbon monoxide leak, but also to examine the unprecedented rescue operation. The helicopter transfer that Sarah had performed was studied as a potential new emergency procedure for similar situations, Chief. Warrant Officer David Kim and his helicopter crew were also recognized for their role in the rescue. The military transfer operation had been executed flawlessly, demonstrating the value of interagency cooperation during aviation emergencies. As the initial excitement of the rescue began to settle, Sarah found herself dealing with a new kind of pressure: fame. Interview requests poured in from television shows, magazines, and documentary producers. Book publishers offered substantial advances for her story, and Hollywood agents called about movie rights. Through it all, Sarah remained focused on what the experience had taught her about herself and her capabilities. She had proven that with enough determination and preparation, even the most impossible challenges could be overcome. The mechanic who had been told she couldn't take the controls had not only flown a commercial airliner but had done so under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. But Sarah knew that her real reward wasn't the media attention or career opportunities. It was the knowledge that 37 people were alive because she had been willing to take an extraordinary risk when it mattered most. 6 months after the incident that made her a household name, Sarah Martinez stood in the cockpit of a brand new Boeing 737-800, wearing the uniform of a Rocky Mountain Airlines captain. The 4 gold stripes on her sleeves represented years of accelerated training, intensive study, and the respect she had earned from an industry that had once doubted her capabilities. The transformation had been remarkable. Following the emergency landing of Flight 447, Sarah had completed her commercial pilot certification in record time. The airline fast-tracked her through their pilot training program, recognizing that her unique combination of mechanical expertise and flying skills made her an invaluable asset. Captain Jennifer Walsh, who had become something of a celebrity herself as the instructor who trained the hero, now served as Sarah's mentor in transitioning from single-engine aircraft to commercial aviation. The bond between instructor and student had deepened into a lasting friendship built on mutual respect and shared passion for flying. "Ready for your first official flight as captain?" Walsh asked as she joined Sarah in the cockpit for the pre-flight inspection. Sarah smiled as she ran through the familiar checklist that she had once studied in secret during her maintenance breaks. "I've been ready for this my whole life," she replied. "I just needed the chance to prove it." The aircraft Sarah was preparing to fly was the same route that Flight 447 had been scheduled to take on that dramatic day 6 months earlier, Denver to Phoenix. Many of the passengers who had been aboard the emergency flight had specifically requested to fly with Captain Martinez on this symbolic journey. Margaret Thompson, the elderly passenger who had spoken at the ceremony honoring Sarah, was among those in the cabin. At 82 years old, she had become one of Sarah's biggest supporters, attending every major event and interview to tell anyone who would listen about the young woman who had saved her life. As passengers boarded the aircraft, many stopped to thank Sarah personally. Children asked for her autograph, while adults expressed their admiration for her courage. Sarah was gracious with everyone, but she was most comfortable when discussing the technical aspects of flying and aircraft safety. The changes in Sarah's life extended far beyond her career advancement. She had used her newfound platform to advocate for greater opportunities for women in aviation, and had established a scholarship fund to help other young women pursue pilot training. Her story had inspired hundreds of women to consider careers in aviation, both as pilots and mechanics. The investigation into Flight 447's carbon monoxide leak had led to industry-wide improvements in aircraft ventilation systems and maintenance procedures. Sarah's unique perspective as both a mechanic and pilot had proven invaluable in developing new safety protocols that could prevent similar incidents in the future. Rocky Mountain Airlines had also benefited from the positive publicity surrounding Sarah's heroic actions. Bookings increased significantly as passengers requested to fly with the airline that employed the hero pilot. The company's safety reputation was enhanced by their association with someone who clearly understood aircraft systems from every angle. As Flight 447's replacement pushed back from the gate, Sarah felt a familiar thrill as she prepared for takeoff. But this time there were no emergency sirens, no unconscious crew members, and no desperate radio calls. This was simply a routine commercial flight with 96 passengers trusting her to get them safely to Phoenix. Denver Tower. Rocky Mountain 447 ready for departure, Sarah radioed as they reached the runway. Rocky Mountain 447, cleared for takeoff runway 34R. Have a safe flight, Captain Martinez. As the aircraft lifted off into the clear Colorado sky, Sarah thought about the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had gone from being dismissed as just a mechanic to becoming one of the most respected pilots in commercial aviation. Her story had proven that expertise, determination, and courage could overcome even the most entrenched barriers. In the cabin, passengers settled in for what they expected to be a routine flight. Many of them had no idea that their captain had once rappelled from a helicopter onto a disabled aircraft to save 37 lives. To them, she was simply Captain Martinez, the professional pilot who would safely deliver them to their destination. But for Sarah, every flight was a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she could go. The woman who had once secretly studied flight manuals during her maintenance breaks was now writing new chapters in aviation history, proving that the sky truly was the limit for anyone willing to work hard enough to reach it. As Flight 447 climbed toward its cruising altitude, Sarah looked out at the endless expanse of blue sky ahead. She had traded her mechanic's coveralls for a pilot's uniform, her wrench for a flight computer, and her place in the hangar for a seat in the cockpit. But she had never forgotten the lessons learned during those years of maintaining aircraft. Attention to detail, respect for the machinery, and understanding that every flight depended on the skill and dedication of the entire aviation team. The passengers aboard Flight 447 that day arrived safely in Phoenix, just as Sarah had promised. For them, it was the end of a pleasant journey. For Sarah, it was the beginning of a career that would inspire countless others to pursue their own, seemingly impossible dreams. Years later, when young women approached Sarah at aviation conferences and air shows, asking how she had managed to break through so many barriers, her answer was always the same. Never let anyone tell you that you can't take the controls of your own destiny. Sometimes the most extraordinary things happen when ordinary people refuse to accept limitations. The mechanic who had once been told she couldn't fly had not only taken the controls but had used them to change the entire industry's perception of what was possible. Her wings had carried her far beyond anything she had ever imagined, proving that with enough determination, even the sky was not the limit.